We did chapter 27 of the book of Acts, and we saw Paul's journey to Rome. And as we went through last week, we saw how the journey wasn't an easy journey. But in the middle of the tempest, it was really easy for us to relate to, because one of the most beautiful verses, which I think we ended up contemplating on quite a bit, is how St. Luke tells us that they were driven rather than they were driving. They were driven in that they lost all control over the ship. And everything was pretty much in the control of the storm. And sometimes in our life, we feel like that. We feel like everything around us is battering us left and right, is really riding us or driving us, and we have no control. And what was most beautiful in that is that in the middle of all that, we see St. Paul praying. And we see him putting everything in the hands of God. And it's being able to live in peace in the middle of tribulation that we can really take out from the first half from most of chapter 27. And like I said to you last week, throughout the book of Acts, we see St. Paul, the evangelist, the theologian, the really, really, really active servant. Chapter 27 and 28, we see St. Paul the Christian, St. Paul the person. And it's a really good lesson for all of us, that the way he conducted himself, one, is an exemplary example for us to follow, and that even in the midst of the hardest, what you could say, trials, he was faithful. But two, we found right at the beginning, even the soldier, the centurion that was in charge of him, because he saw the Christian characteristics that St. Paul exhibited, we found that he also became very friendly towards him. And we did all that last week. And we arrived to around verse 39, which is when they're about to be shipwrecked and about to get out of the boat. I'm going to start reading from verse 29 just so that we can have 10 verses kind of memory before we continue. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God, and in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food for themselves. And in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So here this was the last moments of the ship as the ship is getting wrecked. And as they had realized that they were approaching shore, because they had dropped the measuring and they saw that the distance to the bottom of the sea was getting less, therefore knew that they were approaching the shore. And we spoke how about the soldiers tried to use the raft boats to escape for their life, but St. Paul warned them, saying to them, if you do that, none of you will escape. And there's probably quite a few reasons for that, which we discussed last week. In that these soldiers, the punishment for losing the prisoners was going to be severe. And they were worried that if the prisoners got onto these boats, there was a chance that the soldiers were going to lose them altogether. And there are some of the church fathers that tell us that these raft boats weren't going to be enough for the 260 odd. This is why St. Paul actually goes and tells us how many 276 people, goes out of his way to tell us the number of the people that were on the boat. But what is critical for us is to see the stance of St. Paul. First, that he stands and he commands because of the faith that he had. We saw earlier in the chapter that St. Paul, in the midst of praying, met the angel and God came and comforted him. Here, that gave him the courage to stand and say to them, I've prayed for all of us to escape together or to be safe together. If you go on your own, you will not be saved. And what is also interesting, and we discussed last week as well, is that they were all fasting. And it's like they've learned from Paul the secret. And they all prayed for day. Verse 39. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And when they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, and they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile losing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violent waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them all from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and go to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was, they all escaped safely to land. Here we see that what they did is they tried their best to bring the boat to shore. Dropping the anchors was to slow the boat and try and get it to fix. And trying to aim to run it aground, that is to get it to the shore so that they can escape from it. But obviously what happened is in the waves of the sea, and remembering that we spoke about how much of a big ship this was. This was no small ship, this was one of the big ships that used to carry, it was like a freight ship that used to carry the wheat from Alexandria across to Rome. But the strength of the storm broke down the ship. And what happened here is the soldiers, again fearing for the punishment, wanted to kill the prisoners so that none can escape. But Paul's influence on the centurion goes out of his way to save him. The soldiers knew that they would pay with their own lives if these prisoners escaped. And the centurion knew that very well. But the relationship that he had developed with St. Paul taught him that this man was no normal man. He was an honorable man. And in him commanding the soldiers against their intrinsic reaction, the intrinsic reaction of the soldiers was to kill the prisoners so that they don't lose any. And to stand against that is actually standing against what normally should have been done. So the centurion was impressed so much by Paul that he risked everything to save Paul. Had any other prisoners escaped, the first thing that the soldiers were going to do or say, Julius stopped us from killing them all. I want you to think about the risk that Julius took to save St. Paul. Because the question comes whether it was really a risk or this man had been influenced so much by St. Paul that he had full faith that St. Paul wouldn't do the wrong thing by them. He knew that all these prisoners that were with Paul, he had faith in what St. Paul said. And therefore, telling the guards to not kill the prisoners is because he wanted to save the life of St. Paul. And because he was the highest ranking official, he had to be obeyed. And he was able to make that decision, showing us that God used Julius to save Paul for his ministry, which is we're going to learn about now in Rome. And in doing that, God also helped St. Paul fulfill his promise, fulfill his prediction, fulfill the faith that he had that everyone will be saved on the ship. And that's exactly what happened. Everyone was saved. Chapter 28. Now when they had escaped, they then found out that the island was called Malta. And the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. Now the island of Malta is around 60 miles from Sicily, south of Sicily. Malta had excellent harbours, and it was an ideal spot. It was a city that was ideal for trade. And the islanders that lived on this island that's called Malta were all Phoenician in their ancestry. And because of that, they were actually usually seen by the Romans. Everybody that was non-Roman was seen as some sort of a native that is they have a different culture and a different way of living to that of the Romans. And anybody that did not speak Roman or didn't speak Latin was always described as native. That is un-Roman or non-Roman. But what we see in these natives is that they have mercy. Their hearts are full of mercy. And then Luke goes out of his way to say that these natives showed us unusual kindness. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live." Now God had promised safe passage to St. Paul. We saw that in the previous chapter with the angel. Chapter 27, verses 23 to 25, we see the promise of the angel. St. Paul tells us what the angel said to him. He said to him, if you quickly go to verses 23 to 25, the reminder, "For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. So, St. Paul, God had promised him safe passage, not just through Malta, but all the way to stand to Rome and to serve before Caesar. And he knew that nothing was going to stop that. Now, what we see here in St. Paul, we see that he was really the true servant. St. Paul just landed, correct, on a shipwreck. And the chances are, if you look at all the descriptions of the previous chapter, there was a lot of hard work that was happening. Throwing anchors, making the load lighter, tying the ropes. But St. Paul, being the true servant, was always active. So we find here, out of all people, the person that's actually picking up sticks, trying to feed the fire, to warm everybody is who? Is St. Paul. Vipers usually hide in the cold. But because of the heat, it was out near the fire. And it caught on the hand of who? Of St. Paul. Now the locals knew what kind of snake this was. And this knowledge meant that St. Paul would die. And what we see here, especially in verse 4, that when the natives saw that St. Paul had been struck by this viper, the natural law that existed, which St. Paul talks to us in the book of Romans, remember the natural law? These people hadn't been preached by God. They didn't have the law of Moses. But what we see very clearly, all of a sudden they say, this man must be a murderer, because justice has befalled him. They can see the chains in his hands, so they know that he's a prisoner. They know that he just escaped a certain death in the sea. And here they bring out the justice of the natural law, saying that it looks like he must be a murderer, because although he escaped the sea, justice does not allow him to live. What justice? That's the justice of God. The natural law was in these people. And they knew that there was no escape from the poison of that viper. But God had promised Paul. And because God had promised Paul, this poisonous snake that bit Paul was unable to harm him. And this is a really good reminder to us. For us to remember that our lives are actually in the hands of God, not in the hands of anyone else. St. Paul here, his life was in the hand of God. To continue or to come to an end in good time, our life is in the hand of God. And because God still had work for St. Paul to do, this snake that should have been poisonous, that should have killed Paul, had no effect on Paul at all. To the contrary, we find that St. Paul's going to shake it off and burn it in the fire. And in the Thanksgiving prayer, when we say to tread serpents and scorpions, all the power of the enemy. This is the power that God gives us when our life is in His hand. St. Paul was trying to serve. And in his service was trying to feed the fire so that everybody can be warmer. Verse 5, but he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time, and saw no harm come to him, they changed their mind and said that he was a god. These people were very superstitious, and they believed in many gods. And seeing St. Paul overcome this poison meant that he must be a god. And does this remind us of a similar event that happened? Yes? Does everybody remember where it happened? Yes? Chapter 14. Chapter 14, the same thing happened with St. Paul. And the people there thought that he was a god. If you read 14, verse 11, now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. What did Paul do there? He healed someone who had air, who was crippled from the womb of his mother. Yes? So here, they thought that he was a god. And indeed, the reaction to him is going to be the reaction of someone who is seeing something great in their eyes. But what we're going to see is, we're going to now see the reality of humanity. And that is that humanity is forever changing. Because these same people, a few verses later, are going to pick up stones to stone St. Paul. Many of us live life seeking people's approval. Here we find people calling him a god, and not far, not long, they're going to pick up and try and stone him. And therefore, the true Christian person suffers no sadness when people abuse him, and has no joy when people praise him. Because the same people that praise you today could be the same people that stone you tomorrow. This is what happened with St. Paul. Here they are praising him, and shortly you will see him wanting to stone him. In that region, verse 7, there was an estate of the leading citizen of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. Paul went in to him and prayed, and he laid his hand on him and healed him. What is obvious here is St. Paul continues to minister, even if he is a shipwreck prisoner. He is going to continue to minister. And Paul, in his earnest compassion to everyone, comes and starts praying for this person and ends up actually healing him. Now St. Luke can't help himself. So we find St. Luke here, being the doctor, is actually giving us the medical description of the problem that this leading citizen's dad was suffering. Okay? Publius, what was he suffering from? St. Luke says to us, he was suffering from 2 things. One, a very high temperature, fever, and then he goes out of his way to describe dysentery, which is some sort of diarrhea that involves bleeding. So he's gone out of his way to say or to describe to us, in the explanation, this is a medical explanation. He's medically diagnosing what was actually happening here. But St. Paul continues to minister, And what we see here is we see him performing another miracle. So when, verse 9, so when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. They also honored us in many ways, and when we departed, they provided such things as were necessary. Verse 11. After 3 months, we sailed in an Alexandrian ship whose figurehead was the twin brothers, which had wintered at the island, and landing in Syracuse, we stayed 3 days. From there we circled around and reached Rhegium, and after 1 day the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren and were invited to stay with them 7 days. And so we went towards Rome. And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as Appii Forum and 3 inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. And the question comes here, where did the Roman believers come from? Now, the news or the gospel had spread to Rome in many ways. Because many Jews who lived in Rome used to visit Jerusalem for all the religious festivals. And some had actually been present at Pentecost. We know that from chapter 2 in the book of Acts, verse 10. If you look back at chapter 2, it tells us that there were people from Phrygia, from Pamphylia, from Egypt, and the parts of Libya adjoining Crete, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes. So St. Luke tells us that right at the beginning of the book of Acts. So if you ever wondered, where did these Roman believers come from? That's where they came from. They believed in Christ, and they had brought the message to Rome. And by the time that St. Paul arrived in Rome, his letter to the Romans had already also been written and received by the believers. So there were faithful Christians there. And this is why St. Luke goes out of his way to tell us in verse 15 about the Forum on the Appian Way, which is a town that's about 43 miles south of Rome, and the 3 Taverns, which was a town that's located about 35 miles south of Rome, because this tavern was a bit like a shop or a place that provided food and lodging for travelers, and the Christians went there openly to meet Paul and encourage him. And here in verse 15, it tells us that he was encouraged. Verse 16, now when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with the soldier who guarded him. From here we really see the relationship that is growing more and more between St. Paul and the centurion Julius, to the extent that we find here a huge exception in that everybody was actually handed to the captain of the guard, but St. Paul was permitted to stay on his own with the guard that guarded him. No, we're not going to finish tonight. Yarab. All right. Okay. We'll stop here because it's already 9:45. And we'll finish, it's like 12 verses. We'll finish them next week. Any questions? It was easy today, yeah? There's a little bit in the last few verses, so I'll wait and leave it for next week. عايزين تخلصوا؟